What's something people don't know about the U.S. crackdown on North Korea's illicit coal trade with China? The target vessels suspected of transporting coal from North Korea to China in violation of existing UN sanctions. These sanctions, designed to pressure North Korea into denuclearization, prohibit the sale of North Korean coal. The U.S. argues that the revenue from these coal sales is funneled directly into North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. By targeting the ships facilitating this trade, the U.S. hopes to cut off a vital economic lifeline for the Kim regime. This latest move signals a more aggressive approach to sanctions enforcement. Previous efforts have focused on penalizing companies and individuals involved in illicit trade. However, targeting the vessels themselves represents a significant escalation. It puts pressure on shipping companies and nations where these ships are registered or flagged, potentially disrupting global trade routes. The success of this initiative hinges on international cooperation, particularly from China. China, as North Korea's largest trading partner and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, holds significant sway. Their cooperation, or lack thereof, will largely determine the effectiveness of these new sanctions. The U.S. has called upon China to fully enforce the UN resolutions and to cease any activities that could be construed as facilitating North Korea's sanctioned activities. The response from Beijing will be crucial in determining the trajectory of this latest chapter in the ongoing standoff with North Korea. China's position on North Korea is complex and often shrouded in ambiguity. While officially committed to the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, China also prioritizes stability on its border and maintaining a buffer state between itself and the U.S. allied South Korea. This delicate balancing act has resulted in a history of inconsistent enforcement of UN sanctions against North Korea. China has often been accused of turning a blind eye to illicit activities, arguing that excessive pressure could destabilize the region. The U.S. push for sanctions on vessels involved in the coal trade puts Beijing in a difficult position. On one hand, China is wary of appearing to bow to U.S. pressure, particularly as tensions between the two superpowers remain high on a number of other fronts, including trade and Taiwan. On the other hand, China has its own reasons for wanting to rein in North Korea's nuclear ambitions. An increasingly unpredictable and heavily armed North Korea poses risks for China's own security and regional influence. The potential for increased tensions is palpable. The U.S. has indicated that it will not hesitate to take unilateral action, including imposing sanctions on Chinese entities, if it perceives a lack of cooperation from Beijing. Such a move would undoubtedly further inflame relations between the two countries and could have significant economic repercussions. For China, the challenge lies in finding a way to uphold its commitment to UN resolutions without jeopardizing its own interests or provoking a confrontation with the U.S. The latest sanctions push is but one chapter in a long and often frustrating history of attempting to curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions through economic pressure. The UN Security Council has imposed sanctions on North Korea since 2006, following its first nuclear test. These sanctions have progressively expanded over the years to encompass a wide range of goods and activities, including arms sales, luxury goods, and financial transactions. The effectiveness of these sanctions, however, has been a subject of much debate. Proponents argue that they have slowed down North Korea's nuclear and missile development by squeezing its access to vital resources and technology. They point to the regime's chronic economic woes as evidence of the sanctions' biting impact. Critics, however, counter that the sanctions have done little to deter North Korea's nuclear ambitions, which have only grown bolder over time. They argue that the sanctions have primarily served to punish ordinary North Koreans while doing little to sway the regime's calculations. The fragmented nature of the international community and the lack of a united front have also hampered the effectiveness of sanctions. While the U.S. and its allies have largely been on the same page, other countries such as China and Russia have been more reluctant to implement the full force of the sanctions, citing humanitarian concerns and the need for dialogue. This lack of consensus has allowed North Korea to exploit loopholes and find alternative channels for trade, undermining the overall impact of the sanctions regime. Section 4. The case for and against further action. The U.S. push for enhanced sanctions on North Korea's coal trade has reignited the debate over the efficacy and wisdom of economic pressure as a tool of diplomacy. Proponents of the move argue that it is a necessary step to increase the pressure on the Kim regime and bring it back to the negotiating table. They contend that the coal trade represents a significant source of revenue for North Korea's illicit activities, and that cutting off this lifeline will force the regime to make concessions. Furthermore, they argue that allowing North Korea to continue its sanctioned activities with impunity undermines the credibility of the UN and the international community's commitment to denuclearization. Opponents of the sanctions, however, argue that they are more likely to be counterproductive, hardening North Korea's resolve and increasing regional tensions. They contend that the sanctions will inflict further suffering on the North Korean people, who are already bearing the brunt of the regime's economic mismanagement and international isolation. Moreover, they argue that the sanctions are unlikely to sway the Kim regime, which has shown itself willing to endure significant hardship in pursuit of its nuclear ambitions. Instead, they advocate for a diplomatic solution, arguing that dialogue and engagement, rather than pressure and isolation, are the only viable path to a peaceful resolution.